So what's up with Buddhist celibacy? I'll discuss that and other questions in a Q&A episode coming up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. So it's been a while since I did a real Q&A episode. I've answered some questions on past ones, but taking a few questions and sort of getting at them in a shorter or sort of a more compact kind of format, that I haven't done in a while. So I thought I would start out doing that today. So first question is from Aaron Wang, who asks in the video about secular practice with images and rituals. He says, I wonder if you would do a video on physical fitness in secular Buddhism. I would love your insights. I think I mentioned a long time ago, my first real experience with meditation was in a class called Zen Fitness, which I took in high school, weird class. And in that class, what we did was, basically we did a Zen meditation, or at least some semblance of Zen meditation, partly on a cushion and, following the breath on the cushion, but mostly when we were doing jogging. So we would jog on a track, and the point was to follow your breath while you were jogging on the track. In retrospect, I think it might have been more useful, or either that or I'm remembering it wrong, it might have been more useful to follow the entire body, because we can do a body practice while we're, let's say, running or jogging, just like we would do a body practice while we're doing walking meditation. We're doing walking meditation, the general focus is usually on the motion of the legs or the motion of the body, and simply following the motion of the legs in the same kind of way that we would follow the motion of the breath if we're doing breath meditation. So there's no reason why we couldn't do that while we're running or jogging, simply focusing on the motion of the body and thinking of ourselves as running, in the same way we think of ourselves as sitting while we're sitting. So that's a very simple kind of response. But I'd like to also make us think a bit about the great Zen aphorism, chopping wood and carrying water, that before we're awakened, we should chop wood and carry water, and that after we're awakened, we will chop wood and carry water. This idea being, a number of different ideas here, but one of them is that awakening is kind of mundane, is kind of banal, that we should not think of it as a great change in the way our life is, but that our life will be the same after awakening is attained, if it's ever attained, because life goes on. And so we should not think of a life of an awakened life as somehow up in the clouds with, strumming a lyre or something, but rather it's going to be washing the dishes and chopping the wood. There's also a very strong notion of physical work or physical labor within Zen. If you go to a zendo, a traditional zendo, for any period of time, they'll put you to work. You'll be meditating part of the time, but you'll also be working. You may be indeed chopping wood or carrying water, but you may be washing down the floors of the zendo. You may have a towel in your hands and be going along the floor to wipe it down every day. There are various kinds of physical labor that you will be doing, which I think is good, because exercise and physical labor actually does help our meditative state. It helps our mental state. I mean, I've certainly found this myself. I have a regular practice of exercise that I've had for many years, and I think it is a great help to my meditation. It's a help to, in particular, mental alertness and concentration. We're more alert when we've exercised. We find it easier to concentrate when we've done some exercise as opposed to when we haven't. I did a recent video on stress and meditation, which I'll put up on the screen here. That's really important to keep in mind, because it reduces our stress to do exercise regularly, and that helps, it helps meditation. We have to remember that meditation is a very sedentary kind of practice. Whether it's literally seated meditation or lying down meditation or slow walking, it's very sedentary in general. But in the old days, the days when the Buddha was actually teaching, they typically would have to walk several miles on their alms rounds to get the food that they would bring back for their meals. So they would regularly get at least walking exercise every day, quite a lot. And presumably they would also have to do physical exercise within the Sangha, within their own area, to say build huts, build buildings, rethatch roofs, those kinds of things. In the old days, in the pre-modern days, 500 years BCE, and for centuries thereafter, these things had to be done by the individual. So exercise was just a normal part of life. But nowadays it's much less for many of us. So I think it's important for us to keep in mind that if we do meditation regularly, we should also have a practice of exercise as well. Nevertheless, it's also important to keep in mind that in its essence, the Buddhist path is not a path of bodily exercise. It's not a body path. It's a mental path. And so the point here is not to become, Arnold Schwarzenegger or something. The point is not to become some amazing person on the track. The point is rather to make our lives easier, to make our lives better, to live better lives. And that is done through mental practices, but so we shouldn't think of the exercise as sort of a primary, but we should think of it as a very, very important corollary to our main practice, I think. So the second question here comes from Andrew Shadows, who gave a question on my video on anxiety and fear. And he asks, would you consider approaching the issue of depression from a Buddhist perspective, much in the same way you are wonderfully able to do in this video? I think that both can be deeply interlinked issues, and so maybe depression deserves its own video as well. And I haven't talked a whole lot about depression here. I think we should keep in mind that there's a very important way in which, life is not satisfactory. I mean, that's the first noble truth. And oftentimes, I think we have very high expectations for life. We think that life is going to be very quickly just wonderful, and we come to realize that no matter what wonderful things happen in life, they come to an end. We have to make our peace with the fact that much of life is not wonderful, no matter what a nice life we may live in general. And so we can sometimes get, I think, overly into that kind of viewpoint and seeing what we might call the first noble truth, that is, life is unsatisfactory. We can see that very deeply, but I would say without wisdom. And depression to me is kind of, or at least similar to, in certain ways, mild depression here I mean. Mild depression is sort of similar to seeing the first noble truth without wisdom. And what do I mean by seeing it without wisdom? That when we get into a mildly depressive state, we tend to see the unsatisfactory nature of life, but in a way that's debilitating, in a way that we don't see any way out of it, in a way that it's like there's nothing to be done about it. We become potentially fatalist, we become cynical sometimes, we blame ourselves, we blame other people, and in that way, we sort of get into a bad spiral. And I did a recent video on people saying that Buddhism is pessimistic. I'll put a link to that here. That's one of, the issues, is that people look at the First Noble Truth and think Buddhism is pessimistic, it's sort of depressing. We might get into mild depression if we use this kind of approach. But as I say in that video, the important thing is to realize there's actually also a third and a fourth Noble Truth. That is that there's an escape here. There's a way out of the suffering of daily life. There's a way out of this kind of feeling that life is unsatisfactory. And that's by following the path. So there are things that we can do. The reason it's the wise way to view the First Noble Truth is to view it as something that we can overcome. That's something that we can do stuff to counteract. Even if we don't get all the way to awakening, nevertheless, we can make things better for ourselves and for other people. Now, I really do have to pause for a moment and say, I'm talking about mild depression, the kind of thing that we all, or many of us, get into from time to time, the sort of thing that I've certainly felt in my own life from time to time. Severe depression, on the other hand, is a medical condition. And severe depression is the sort of thing that I don't think we should expect normal practices on a path to be able to get us away from. Severe depression is the sort of thing that if we are experiencing, or if somebody that we know is experiencing, we should get a doctor involved. We should contact somebody, we should reach out, because that's the sort of thing that can be treated but should be treated by a specialist rather than by me, and I'm certainly not a specialist, either, on videos or in person. So, yeah, so if extreme depression is the issue, we should look elsewhere. And I have a video also about the difference between a Buddhist practice and psychotherapy, because they are actually quite different, in my opinion. Similarities, but different. But so long as we're only talking about mild depression, that can be helped by meditation. It seems there's at least some preliminary evidence, sketchy evidence from the medical literature, but even if we put that aside, it does seem, from my own experience, and maybe yours as well, that meditation can help mild depression. So too can metta practice or loving-kindness practice. Loving-kindness practice, if we do it regularly for several minutes a day, can also help to alleviate a mild depression, just the way it can alleviate fear and anxiety, as I said in the video. And it can also be helped by doing exercise. Exercise is very helpful to mild depression. And I think any kind of any way that we can get ourselves out of our ruminative mindset can help. So just going out and running errands, going out and meeting people, getting on kind of a path, any kind of a path that is ethical and beneficial, and not some sort of cultic thing that's going to become a problem. But virtually any kind of thing that we can do regularly, a kind of a hobby or a path or a structure to our lives, can help with mild depression. But as far as this channel goes, I would certainly recommend meditation. I would recommend metta or loving-kindness practice, and I would certainly recommend exercise. And those three things alone can really make a very big difference if you do them regularly. But each of them has to be done regularly. That means daily, at least 5 days a week, I would say. Or, as many days as you can, of course, and as much as you can, of course, but the more you do them, the better. And if you do them infrequently, by which I mean once a week or less, they're not going to have that much effect. Third question today comes from Poikiki, who asks, in the video on desire and desire the root of suffering, asks, in this video you touched on one of the issues that makes me doubt about the whole scheme of ideas put out by the Buddha. On the one hand, you say that there are skillful and unskillful desires, and I agree with that. But how come Buddhist monks cut out sexuality in all forms? I can't understand how restraining yourself from having a sexual relationship, which is completely natural and is necessary in most cases, can bring you any closer to enlightenment. In fact, I believe it could make you more vulnerable towards abusing other people sexually. There are many cases of teachers abusing students both in Buddhism, Christianity, and probably other religions. It may sound harsh, but in the past weeks I've felt quite disappointed with Buddhist philosophy because it seems to propose non-attachment, but it sounds a lot like detachment in the end. Any thoughts? Thank you for your phenomenal work. Well, thank you so much, Poikiki, for that kind comment. It may very well be that the people you're listening to are talking about detachment rather than non-attachment. I don't know. Not every teacher is perfect. And spiritual bypassing, which is something I described in a prior video, if you don't know about it, is something that happens to all of us. That sometimes when things get tough for us, we can just bypass them and pretend they don't exist. And that is certainly a big pitfall within any kind of spiritual path, or just within daily life, frankly. So it may very well be that what you're talking about is spiritual bypassing, is detachment. But let's assume not. Certainly it wasn't always that way, or it doesn't have to always be that way. Most important thing here, I think, to say is that the Buddha did not recommend celibacy for everyone. He did not recommend celibacy for householders, for lay people. He knew that it was, as you say, it was necessary for lay people. They have families, children. Lay support for the Sangha was absolutely essential because the Sangha was structured so that they could not feed themselves. They were not allowed to. They had to rely on lay support for food, for lodging, for medicine, that kind of thing. So there had to be lay people. And there is nothing ethically wrong within a Buddhist context about being a layperson. There's nothing ethically wrong with having a committed sexual relationship within Buddhism. There's nothing wrong with sexuality at all, as long as you're not doing it in a way that harms people within Buddhism. So there's nothing even wrong within Buddhism about premarital sex, as long as it's being done with the consent of everybody involved, there's nothing wrong with it. Being a householder from an early Buddhist context is right and good. It's ethically right. It's ethically good. There's nothing wrong with it. And that's important to stress and emphasize and remember in what I'm going to say. The only problem with it is that it's not the best sort of life to lead, according to the Buddha. It's a life of suffering. And there are other lives, according to the Buddha, that are lives of less suffering. And they're lives that are monastic in general. At least in their general thrust, are going to be monastic. And I think if we put very much thought into it, we can realize why he might have said such a thing. There's a lot of difficulty around sexuality that we find within daily life. The most famous dramas and tragedies that we're familiar with from daily life or from the news or from the stage or the screen usually revolve around issues of romance and sexuality, that jealousy, greed, and hatred tend to come up in these kinds of contexts that are emotionally charged. Because any kind of a context of romance and sexuality is by nature emotionally charged. It's the kind of thing that wraps us up in emotions, that makes us cling to things, that makes us want things. That's just the nature of the beast, as it were. And of course, with romance and sexuality, there's an enormous amount of good, an enormous amount of pleasure and wonderful stuff there. Nobody would deny that. But inevitably, they involve attachment. And change being the way it is, old age, sickness, and death will befall all of us. We're going to have to come to terms with the loss of our romantic partner. We're going to have to come to terms with the loss of a marriage, whether it's through divorce or through death or through illness. These things are things that we have to come to terms with, and they're things that make life harder for many of us. Now, I mean, obviously, to be clear, of course, I am married, I am, in a committed relationship, I'm a householder, so to me, these are things that I keep in mind. They're things that I try to practice with. They're things that I, can see issues with, and I can understand why the Buddha would say what he says about them. I still prefer to have this kind of relationship. On the other hand, if my wife were to pass away, who knows, maybe I would prefer a sort of a more monastic kind of lifestyle. It's one of the things that I would keep in mind. Probably one of the most famous statements that the Buddha makes, definitive statements that the Buddha makes in the early texts is in the Alagaddupama Sutta, where the sutta starts with him rebuking a monk named Aritta, who basically seems to have been going around saying that there's nothing wrong with being a monk and having sexual relationships, because presumably he's detached, he's non-attached to them, he's able to sort of look beyond them, and so it's not a problem for him. And the Buddha reacts quite strongly against this and says, bhikkhus, that is monastics, that one can engage in sensual pleasures without sensual desires, without perceptions of sensual desire, without thoughts of sensual desire, that is impossible. In other words, for the Buddha, at least as reflected in the early texts, attachment is inevitable. If we're going to be in a sexual relationship, in a relationship of any length, a romantic relationship, attachment inevitably results. There's no way to avoid it. If we live lives of sensuality where we are exposing ourselves to very pleasurable sensations of whatever kinds they may be, we're going to inevitably become attached to them. And so the practice is very much, especially the early practice, is very much making us aware of that and making us aware of the dangers in sensuality, the dangers in attachment to pretty and beautiful and pleasant things. Now, Poikiki raises the issue of sexual abuse within Buddhist sanghas, and it's certainly the case that there have been some problems. But the question is whether these problems are due to celibacy per se. And here, I think I would want to push back on that a little bit, because sexual abuse clearly is a problem within people who are not celibate at all. In fact, we've seen in the news over the last months and years many examples of sexual abuse within regular lay householder society. Further, a number of very high-profile sexual abusers within Buddhism have been Zen priests. And Zen priests are allowed to marry. They don't have, they don't have a celibate lifestyle. And this is one of the ways that they're quite different, actually, from the monastics of early Buddhism. And as well, some of the other practitioners, Buddhist gurus, leaders who have gotten into trouble have been in the Vajrayana community. And the Vajrayana community is one which, even if some of them are not celibate, others may be celibate, but they supposedly, or this is the teachings are much more positive towards sexuality in general than the early Buddhist teachings were, let's say. Nevertheless, they have also had problems. Now, my own opinion is that these sexual scandals and sexual abuse scandals are more due to issues of power structures and secrecy than due to anything having to do with celibacy per se. So, for example, in the Catholic Church, we've had a number of very, very long-term abuse scandals, but I think those are more due to the power structure within the Church, which keeps certain priests above question and keeps a lot of their interactions secret with people. Certainly the power structure enables the secrecy, because if you have enough power, you're able to quash any kind of serious investigation. And we've seen that as well within certain Buddhist circles, where gurus who are of sufficient power within their sanghas are able to basically silence any ability to investigate. So I think it's important both to, react against any kind of a dharma of secrecy within communities, and also to react against an implicit power structure, a very extreme power structure between leaders and the rest of the sangha. What we need is a much more level kind of sangha where other practitioners can credibly come up with rebukes of people who step out of line, so that at least when abuse happens, it can be caught. And here also, within a traditional sangha, there is, of course, much more a level kind of atmosphere. We don't have traditionally very, very high leaders, a very large difference between leadership and the rest of the monastics. We also have, within the early texts, the early sangha, and Theravada sanghas at least of a traditional take, a much more strict rules, which is called the patimokkha, which are the rules that monks have to vow to abide by when they become monks. And these are very strict. In other words, they include things such as you're not allowed to be alone with somebody of the opposite sex. You're not allowed to touch somebody of the opposite sex. You're not allowed to be off in the distance with somebody of the opposite sex. You're not allowed to sleep under the same roof with somebody of the opposite sex. Now, I mean, we can come up with some issues here. Obviously, there's issues with homosexuality. If people are homosexual, then it's not the opposite sex that's the problem. But laying aside those issues, this is at least something more of a serious attempt to say, look, if you're going to be in a position of power with regard to, let's say, lay people, because you'll be held in high regard as a monastic, that you should also be held to a stricter set of rules. And those should be really quite strict. We have to remember that these rules are undertaken completely voluntarily. That is, nobody's forced to undertake the patimokkha. They have to do it because they want to. Presumably they do it because they say, look, I've seen that I have a problem with X, whatever X might be, and at least if I undertake to do these rules, the group of people that I'm around will keep an eye on me and make sure that I don't get myself into situations where whatever this is might be an issue for me. So there are, I think, benefits to that, and it comes under the general rubric within an early Buddhist practice of what's called guarding the sense doors. So within a lay context, we can also do this. If we know that we're liable towards greed, we're liable to spend too much if we go to the mall, and we may have a ritual of going to the mall every weekend, and we find that we're spending too much for our salary, we may say, look, I'm going to guard my sense doors. I'm going to decide not to go to the mall this weekend, or I'm going to decide to go to the mall only once a month, because we see that we have a problem, and so we undertake kind of a rule, a kind of a vow, to guard our sense doors, to not put ourselves into situations where our senses can get ensnared by things that can be problematic for us, that we know at this stage in our progress along the path may still be a problem. And so this is, I think, the same reason why monastics might undertake the patimokkha. That's to say, I know of a problem with desire for the opposite sex, and so if I put myself into a position where I'm just going to be around people of the opposite sex all the time, I know I'm going to get myself into trouble. So why don't I just put myself into a situation where people will keep an eye on me and I'm making a public vow not to do this? So, this may not be a path for you. It's not a path for me at this point in my life, for sure. But it's one that I think if people find it necessary and useful for them, then I think more is the power that they should do it. We should also keep in mind, I think importantly, that human nature being what it is, there's no way to totally overcome human misbehavior. We're always going to have greed, hatred, and ignorance. We're always, at least as long as everybody is not awakened. And monastics are generally not awakened either. So we're always going to have abuse within a monastic context. We shouldn't expect that monastics are going to be perfect, because they're not. We shouldn't expect any human group, any human society to be perfect, because it's not. So one thing that we can do as students is not to have too much confidence in our teachers, not to expect that they know way more than they do. And this is one of the things I gave a recent video about as well, that we should keep that in mind. That teachers, unless we are absolutely sure that they're awakened, and the problem is that even saying that creates problems, because if we believe that our teacher is awakened, then we're liable to follow them down a garden path if they're not awakened. So what I would say in general is the Buddha's advice: have yourself as an island, have yourself as a refuge, have the Dharma as a refuge. And if you have yourself and the Dharma as a refuge, you're probably not going to go wrong. But maybe all these answers I've given you raise more questions. And if so, please leave them down below. I love answering them, and I love seeing them, and I love it when other people also answer them, because then we get some discussion going, and it's not just me giving my own opinion, because I'm sure many of you have better opinions than I do on some of these things. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for my supporters on Patreon. It makes a great deal of importance to me, and a good feeling to have people behind me. If you're interested as well in checking that out and checking some of the posts I have over there, the link is down below. And I hope that we'll catch all of you on the next one of these videos. And maybe we'll have some more Q&As in the future. So thanks so much, and be well. Bye-bye.